Well, this is a real privilege and really great to see all of you and to be able to talk about Lewis and his wartime broadcasts. I want to offer my thanks first to Professor Davis, who has set this whole thing up. And I'm sure he's had some help, like help from the dean. But nonetheless, this was a great idea. It's come to pass. We got off to a great start last time with Professor Davis's talk. And as soon as he put out the list for you to populate last summer, I guess it was, I jumped right on and took the second slot in order to get it over with, I guess, before reading week. So I'm going to try to stick to the 15 to 20 minutes. So I won't be droning on for an hour at all, but I will try to fill those 15 to 20 minutes that Professor Davis has allotted us in order to talk about Lewis and the Second World War, in particular his series of broadcasts that many of you will know would eventually be published in 1952 as Mere Christianity. They had been published in a couple of different formats and then were brought together in 1952, and that book just keeps selling. Lewis's books have sold hundreds of millions of copies. He didn't get to see or benefit from that directly, dying in 1963, but nonetheless he is a kind of publishing phenomenon in that way. So I'll start with just a minute of a couple of anecdotes that, yes, cut into the 15 or 20 minutes, but given the topic. So a long time ago, when I was a graduate student at Oxford, I went to the C.S. Lewis Society, and it was eye-opening for a young evangelical from North America to find out that Lewis smoked a pipe and drank beer, and that the C.S. Lewis Society met in a place called Pusey House, which was a monument to Anglo-Catholicism, which I was told C.S. Lewis was in his own churchmanship. So the Lewis I had been exposed to was the Lewis of Wheaton College and so forth. And the first night I went to the C.S. Lewis Society, the room, as I discovered, was essentially divided between the North American evangelicals and the pipe-smoking, beer-drinking British Anglo-Catholics. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And there was a bit of tension in the room. Not didn't come to blows or anything like that, but it was sort of like, this is our Lewis and that's your Lewis. And his literary executor, a name some of you will recognize, Walter Hooper, was still alive in those days and was there clearly on the Anglo-Catholic side of the room, and on it went. Anyway, it met 8 times over the term for all 3 terms, and I continued to go along. Only last year did I ever make it out to the kilns where he lived, just outside of Oxford. It's now used by the C.S. Lewis Foundation, but I was over there last year and happened to be in Oxford, and was staying at a friend's house. And as we got to it, there was a sign for the kilns, which is now on Lewis Close. And I said, well, this couldn't be more perfect. So we drove up to the house. I got out of the house and I said, out of the car, and I said, just a moment, I need to go somewhere. I need to go and see the kilns. And he said, oh, go ahead. So 30 seconds later, I was standing in front of the kilns. Okay, the talk itself. So just a moment of context. The Second World War, breaks out in September, you'll remember, of 1939. Britain declares war on September 3rd, after Germany has invaded Poland. Canada will join the war a week later. So very much changes beginning in the fall of 1939. Remember, Lewis is up at Oxford. He's a fellow of Magdalen. He's had really a spectacular kind of academic career. He got a triple first as an undergraduate. He's made a fellow 1925. He's mid-career. He's known academically. He's beginning to be known. For his non-academic lecturing. He's beginning to be known both as a speaker and a preacher, as well as a lecturer. But his vocation, of course, keeps him at Magdalen. When the war breaks out, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is already, and it's only been in existence since 1922, it's already central to British culture in this newfangled world of radio broadcasting. And the BBC now has a particular role to play in the Second World War. The BBC in those days, and this was really a function of its founder, a very stern Scottish Presbyterian who ate a lot of oatmeal, named John Reith. And the BBC came into existence to, in part, uplift the nation. The CBC here at home would come into existence a decade later with some of the same ideas, in fact. And public broadcasting is popping up all over the place, Australia and so forth. But the BBC is now central to British culture. And when the war breaks out, it's given particular tasks. And part of those tasks involve just simply information, partly too propaganda in a way, trying to unify the nation in war. And part of it is this uplift question. How can radio be used to unite and uplift the nation? And the nation was, in lots of ways, in public terms, Christian. There was an expectation that the BBC would present the Christian message in one way or another. There were blocks of time during the broadcast day that were given over to religious topics, to sermons, to the playing of hymns. Some of this continues right down to today. But that's partly Lewis's world. Lewis, at the beginning of the war, is not familiar with broadcasting. Radio is its own thing. You've got to fill the 10 or 12 or 15 minutes. There can't really be pauses. You have to know how to fill it. You have to know what to say. You have to be able to chunk it, as they call it in the business, apparently. So Lewis is not familiar with any of that. But what he is becoming more familiar with is speaking to non-specialist audiences about complicated, important things. No academic will like this quote from Lewis. Any fool can write learned language, right? Any fool can write jargon, right? Specialist jargon, so he says. The vernacular is the real test. If you can't turn your faith into it, then either you don't understand it or you don't believe it. Now, Lewis in person was formidable. He had a very plummy English accent, clipped vowels. He didn't suffer fools gladly. When you read some of the accounts of his former undergraduates, some of them loved him, and some of them ran screaming from their tutorials. Right? They couldn't take it anymore. Immense intellectual power, quite remarkable. So how does it begin for Lewis? The radio talk, as it came to be known, the radio talk was a growing genre. Millions of people listen to the BBC all day long, listening to a variety of programs. Some of them were war specific. Some of them were more general. Some of them were intellectual. Some of them were philosophical. Some of them were entertaining, comedic. But millions of people tuned in. The war meant that they tuned into other sorts of programs. In Your Garden was one. Why? Because there was a Dig for Victory campaign. There was a show called Kitchen Front. Right? Kitchen Front. One of the fronts in the war was the kitchen, to try to get the most out of British agricultural produce. So all sorts of things begin to happen, all sorts of things begin to change in terms of what's on the radio at this point in time. At the beginning, probably the most famous Briton, Churchill, didn't like the radio. He becomes prime minister, and we won't rehearse all of that, but he becomes prime minister after initially being called back to the cabinet. And during the 1930s, Churchill was on the radio exactly 4 times. The BBC didn't want him on the radio. He had the wrong view. The BBC was sympathetic to the government of the day and appeasement. So they didn't want Churchill on the radio. And he was happy not to be on the radio. But war changes it. War changes the sorts of demands. Churchill, of course, becomes more interested in the radio as a tool to try to win the war. If words could kill, then Britain would be dead already, Churchill said in 1939. He wanted to use different kinds of words, and he would do, and some of you, of course, are very familiar with Churchill's speeches on the BBC and in Parliament. The famous Finest Hour speech, maybe his greatest, comes after Dunkirk in the middle of June of 1940 with the advent of the Battle of Britain. There are other prominent radio personalities. Matthew Halton, CBC broadcaster, Edward R. Murrow, CBS broadcaster. Radio is front and center by 1940. At the BBC, the director of religious broadcasting was a man named James Welch, Reverend James Welch, which gives you an idea that they took this seriously. And Welch was assisted by a man named Eric Fenn. And by 1940, Britain is in peril. We won't rehearse all of that. But Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, and the Blitz from the fall of 1940. Lewis publishes his first theological book in 1940, The Problem of Pain. Some of you know it, some of you have read it, some of you have probably got it on your shelf. His first theological book. Welch, director of religious broadcasting at the BBC, read it, liked it, thought, here's someone who can speak to the nation in peril in certain kinds of religiously uplifting ways. Here's a voice, or here are words. Don't know about the voice. Right? Wasn't sure about the voice initially. Would he have the right voice for radio? That does matter, I'm told. Anyway, he liked the book, so did Fenn. So Welch, on February the 7th, 1941, wrote Lewis. And this is what he said. I won't read the whole letter. Dear Mr. Lewis, I address you by name because, although we have never met, you cannot be a stranger after allowing me and many others to know some of your thoughts and convictions which have been expressed in your book, The Problem of Pain. He goes on. I write to ask whether you would be willing to help us in our work of religious broadcasting. 2 topics. You might be willing to speak about the Christian or lack of Christian assumptions underlying modern literature. For Lewis, no, that's vocational. Not interested in that. The second option was a series of talks on something like, wrote Welch, The Christian faith as I see it by a layman. I am sure there is a need of a positive restatement of Christian doctrine in lay language, but there may be other subjects on which you would rather speak. The whole idea of broadcasting may be unattractive to you. But if it is not, I wonder whether it would be possible to meet and talk sometime. So he puts it out there, February of 1941. Lewis replies politely, cautiously, not sure he wants to be doing this. He certainly doesn't want topic number one. That's my day job. I'm not doing that on the radio. That's not where I've been heading recently either. And that's not what the country needs. That's not what the nation needs. So he ultimately says yes. So then what? What's it going to be? The suggestion has been made, some kind of talk by a layman on Christianity. What would the title be? How would it be encapsulated? Well, the first title that they floated was this: The Art of Being Shocked. These Humans was another one. Inside Information was a third possibility. None of these are particularly arresting. Finally, just put it out there: right and wrong. Right and wrong. So they discussed not only the title, but how these talks would be given. They decided on 4 15-minute talks, 15 minutes, just like today, and I'm probably at 15 minutes already, so sorry. See how hard it is? 4 15-minute talks. Lewis is busy. He says, I can really only do this during the vacation, the Oxford vacation 3 times a year. I can't be doing it during my day job. I'm a busy man. I'm also lecturing outside of here. He became a kind of honorary chaplain for the Royal Air Force at the time. He also preached. Preached in Oxford. He preached elsewhere. On June the 8th, 1941, he preached a sermon at St. Mary the Virgin, the University Church in Oxford. It's right on the High Street. Newman was its vicar back in the 19th century. Famous church, famous pulpit. Hasn't changed a bit. Used to be packed. Now there's 6 people there on a Sunday, but that's how things go. It was packed for him. It was packed for Lewis on June the 8th, 1941. And the sermon was called The Weight of Glory. Now some of you will know the sermon. It was later published. It's 45 minutes. 45-minute sermon. I don't know how many sermons nowadays are 45 minutes. Probably not very many. Full on 45 minutes, The Weight of Glory, in which he says this, among other things. If we consider the unblushing promises and staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. We are far too easily pleased. Well, that's 30 seconds? So there's 44 and a half minutes of sermon beyond that. But that sermon, The Weight of Glory, seems to have sort of encapsulated for Newman what he wanted, or for Newman, no, there's a slip, for Lewis, what he was going to try to say in these 4 lectures. So he got down to business. He wrote them out. They were all going to be live. That's why there's only one, and I'll put it on. That's why there's only one extant today, which you can look up on Google easily enough. His first broadcast was on August the 6th, 1941, 7:45 p.m., 15 minutes, a reasonable slot. But if you're in the radio and TV business, you want to be taken into your slot by a good program that people are going to be listening to. That wasn't the case. 15 minutes before Lewis was a program called News in Norwegian. Now that was important because remember, Norway had been invaded. The British tried to do something about that. It all fell apart. So there was a listenership, overseas service in Norway, that depended on news in Norwegian, wanted news in Norwegian. Nobody in England was listening to it, but in Norway they were. Nonetheless, off he goes, off he goes. Common decency, right and wrong, common decency, really an exposition on the natural law that Professor Davis was talking about last week, was the first one, and off he went. Now these lectures were every week for that month, for August of 1941, these talks. They were immediately popular, immediately popular. The BBC paid him 10 guineas per talk. A guinea is an old unit, pound and a shilling. It's kind of an aristocratic tinge to it. He gave the money away. He gave it to charities, he gave it to individuals. He said, you can pay me, but I'm not keeping the money, I'm going to give it away. But I do need the train fare from Oxford to London. That I'm not giving away, that I need. If I'm going to come down here all these nights, in the middle of wartime, and speak into a mic for 15 minutes, and then go back to Oxford in the dark of night, you've got to pay for that. And that was absolutely fine. Welch and Fenn love it. They love it. They want more. They want more. So they get more. Lewis agrees. Okay, we'll do it again. The next series, What Christians Believe, okay. January of 1942. January of 1942. By January of 1942, the war has not really turned for the better, but some things have been survived. Battle of Britain has been survived. The Blitz is going full on. 40,000 plus will die in London over 8 months. 3 times that many will be injured. So it's full on. The United States is now in the war. Better late than never. Churchill had campaigned for that. He literally danced when Roosevelt said, we're in. December the 8th, 1941. Literally danced. And unusual for Churchill, offered a prayer of thanksgiving that the United States had finally entered the war. But this is the beginning of 1942. The idea that these radio broadcasts can clarify, can help, can unify, that can make the sufferings of war more intelligible, were something that Welch and Fenn continued to want to do, and that Lewis himself wanted to do. These talks would give to us, and I'll just read a couple of short excerpts, would give to us the language of mere Christianity. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he'd be the devil of hell. Right? The classic Lewis trilemma that comes to us as being a central feature of mere Christianity. In this way too, Lewis is beginning to reach an enormous audience. It's not clear just how many people were listening. Welch had said, we can guarantee you 1 million. It was many more than that. Hard to say how many more, but it was many more than that. These talks would begin, of course, to have a huge impact on Lewis's private life. He became a kind of radio celebrity. People were writing to him all the time. Mostly these were positive letters. They were letters of thanks. They were letters of inquiry. They were letters of comfort. Some of them were critical. The Inklings, they weren't critical, but they were a little suspicious of any Oxford dawn becoming a radio dawn, or later a teledawn, right? This still exists in the UK. Right? Tolkien was a little concerned. He thought it was good, and he thought Lewis was doing the country a service. But he said in Oxford, as he would later comment, you can only write two kinds of books. Right? You can write a book in your field, right? Or you can write a detective novel. And if you do anything else, you're not going to be respected. You're going to be suspect. Now, it was tongue in cheek. He said, everybody gets sick. You're lying in bed with the flu. Write a detective novel. Right? But don't venture into trying to be expert on something you're not expert in. Right? Lewis disregarded that. Right? He disregarded that. Fourth and final series, February, March 1944. Right? There's been a bit of a time lag. There are some issues between Lewis and Welch and Fenn, and Lewis is getting a little tired, actually, of the broadcast routine. He still thinks it's important. He still wants to do it. There are some practical issues. There's some strain. He becomes something of a reluctant broadcaster near the end. They want him more and more. They want him on the radio all the time, actually. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want that. He had a particular idea of what he was doing. Just becoming a radio broadcaster was not part of that. So he resists. He resists. He will go on the radio a few more times. There's only five recordings of Lewis altogether in the sound archives. That's all that's been preserved. Only one of the talks, as I mentioned earlier, they were almost all live. Didn't record much in those days. Part of it was the censor, part of it was it cost money. Metal, acetate, it's wartime, there are better uses for those things. So there's only one from 1944, the last series, that was saved. Let me conclude with this. Edward R. Murrow, who I mentioned earlier, famous CBS broadcast journalist during the Second World War, said Churchill, during his speechifying, both in Parliament and on the BBC, had mobilized the English language and sent it into battle, one of Murrow's most famous quotes. Well, I might say that Lewis did something like that for the popular presentation of Christianity during the Second World War. On the one hand, he was part of what became a wartime innovation in broadcasting, the religious radio talk, and he wasn't the only one. We're going to be hearing about Dorothy Sayers. I think Professor Reynolds is going to be talking about Dorothy Sayers later this year. Dorothy Sayers was on the radio. Famous radio play of hers, Man Born to be King, was a knockout. Right? Person I worked on later, her name was Marjorie Parham, first Africanist in British history. I wrote a biography of her. Listening to that play, she says, brought her back to her childhood faith, brought her back to Christianity. T.S. Eliot was on the radio. J.B. Priestley was on the radio. So Lewis was part of a cadre during the Second World War, probably the most famous member of it, but part of a cadre that was beginning to innovate in terms of delivery on the radio. He also helped to open up Christian broadcasting. One of his biographers talks about the ecclesiastical tyranny of the Church of England and its relationship to the BBC prior to C.S. Lewis. So the only people you heard speaking about the Christian faith or presenting the Christian faith in one way or another were the prelates of the church. Lewis was not that. Lewis was not that. He also took religious broadcasting away simply from Sunday. It had been something that was on Sunday only. Wednesday night, whenever. One of the series went to the Forces Network. It wasn't even on the BBC Home Service. It went directly to the soldiers. And he got all kinds of mail from soldiers who said, the barracks is never quiet. The only time the barracks is quiet is during your 10 minutes. And they only gave him 10 minutes for the third series. He prepared 15. Then they said, sorry, this is the armed forces. You get 10 minutes. Huh? Oh, well, then I'll just start chopping. So he chopped it down to 10 good minutes. Soldiers essentially all at attention. Finally, it meant, too, that a Christian layperson, which was very unusual in this period, Christian layperson was speaking about the faith in depth, using theological language, but not solely theological language. After the 1940s, he wasn't much interested in radio broadcasting. He kept writing Narnia and so forth, and other things occupied his time. And then, of course, he died relatively young, even for the time, you'll remember. The same day as John F. Kennedy, who took all the news. Also, Aldous Huxley died on the same day. So he took some of the news away from Lewis's passing. But I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll ask a question to start us off. You mentioned that Tolkien said that the two things you're allowed to do is at Oxford Dawn is to write detective novels and books within your own field. So how much do you think that played into the fact that Lewis's name was put forward twice for chairs at Oxford, and both times he was defeated, even though Tolkien himself championed Lewis's name? Do you think that had any role to play in his not getting those chairs?
It did, but it's hard to track down what anyone would consider to be hard evidence. There clearly was feeling that anyone who was seeking to be known outside of their field was suspicious. So, and we have to remember that celebrity culture is different in this period. It's, I mean, our society is essentially dominated by celebrity culture. But in the 1920s and 1930s and 40s, celebrity culture is a new and an unwelcome thing for a lot of people. I mean, I've done some work on T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and Lawrence is sometimes seen as the first modern celebrity, backing into the limelight. So on one hand, he sort of liked it because he didn't quite know what he was getting into, and then when he saw what he was getting into, he didn't like it. And throughout his letters of the time, he's always concerned that this celebrity is going to demean him. He's not going to be seen as a serious person. He's just a celebrity. Well, there's something like that going on with Lewis. Now, he was willing to sort of suffer being a celebrity because he thought what he was doing during the war was of real national value. But that didn't mean that electors at Oxford, electing chairs, took the same view. And one of the reasons he left to go to Cambridge was that. Yeah, in 53, I think. Yeah.
Because he was on the cover of Time magazine, which I take it didn't do him good.
Not really. Not really. No. Whereas today it would be, well, it's just seen differently. Yeah. Other comments are good, Professor?
I'm just curious to hear what, like, at what point was broadcast starting to be picked up and known and celebrated abroad, like in Canada or other places across Europe, or like how much access would they have had to those broadcasts directly, or since they weren't recording? Like, yeah, I'm just kind of curious, at what point did it become famous worldwide for these broadcasts?
For the broadcasts themselves, the fame isn't worldwide, although they do, the BBC World Service, you could access them through the World Service. So they do begin to make him known in North America and elsewhere. And in fact, before Mere Christianity, they'll be published in Britain and in the United States. I think in the US it was called The Case for Christianity. It came out a little bit ahead of Mere Christianity. So the initial fame is essentially British, but by the second series, and certainly by the fourth series in 1944, people outside of Britain are now able to access the talks, not live typically. So since they weren't recorded, there were transcripts that were available. It was sort of a complicated way of making him known, but it had begun. Yes, Professor Garrett.
T.S. Eliot as a reading character. I'm wondering, like, was he doing plays, or was he actually a person who would be a guest on shows, or how
No, he. Some of you might know this, but Little Gidding. He did Little Gidding on the radio. Maybe some other things too. I don't know whether he was a guest. There weren't sort of chat shows in the same way in those days. There were radio talks, but no, he was on in his own right. Yeah, in his own right. Yeah. As far as I know, Churchill and Lewis never met. It would be inconceivable that Churchill hadn't heard of him. But there's no record. Yeah. And he was probably jealous that Lewis sounded like someone he would like to sound like. Remember, Churchill had a small speech impediment of which he was very self-conscious. So he had to work at that, and it became worse when he was tired and under the pressure of broadcasting during the war and making sure the speech was laid out in precisely the way it needed to be before he went to air. It was all. It comes off very naturally when you listen to one of his speeches. It was the most unnatural thing imaginable. Double spacing. The words would cascade down the page in a certain way, so his eye would be drawn towards the corner, and then he would turn. Whereas Lewis turned out to be a bit of a natural, and was used to public speaking of a certain kind. Churchill was used to public speaking, but it was stumping mostly and big oratory in the House. Whereas Lewis knew how to speak to a small group, and he sort of imagined that that's what he was doing with these talks. Yeah. Yes.
Can we say that most homes at that time had radios?
Not most, but the figure that the BBC was using at the time was that BBC newscasts, wartime newscasts, were being listened to by 16 million people, which was about a third of the population at any given time. And they said that 16 million people was a multiplier effect. That meant probably 4 or 5 million homes had radios. Yeah. So it was a great business to be in. It was an exploding business in the 1930s and 40s, That's what would dominate, of course, for another decade, and then along came TV. But what you also read about, and some of the letters that would come to Lewis would say that they listened to him in the pub, because most pubs had a radio, and for a lot of people that's where they got their news, because the pubs would fill up at mealtime, in particular, in the evening, and then the news would be played, and if there was an important speech, Churchill's speech and so forth, then that would be played. So a lot of people who didn't have radios at home could go down the pub and get their news. Yeah.
Is that where you get your news today?
Down the pub. I'm one of the last people on my street that gets the newspaper, and I can tell the newspaper delivery guy is a little bit annoyed by this. Like, I have to drive to your street and hand out 3 or 4 copies of the newspaper when I could be doing something else. So he just chucks it, and sometimes it lands on the porch, and sometimes it doesn't. But he just keeps driving. But, yeah. So no, I'm that's how still. Yeah.
We got time for one more question.
Another. Yes.
Do we know if he brought some of these talks to the England before and actually broadcast them?
That's not clear. What is clear, because this is talked about, is he rehearsed the weight of glory with the Inklings. He wanted their opinion on that. Not sure whether the individual talks might have gotten a run through, but to the extent that the weight of glory sort of put him on the path of this is what I'm going to try to say, then the Inklings were privy to that.
Professor Faught for sharing with us.